On June 26, 2024, the state of Texas executed the man who murdered 18-year-old Bridget Townsend. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 in the evening, inside the death chamber in Huntsville. It was Bridget's birthday. According to her mother and multiple news accounts, she would have turned 41. 23 years earlier, Bridget vanished from a home in the Texas Hill Country, and for nearly 2 years no one knew what had happened to her, until the man responsible finally confessed and led investigators to her remains. Her mother later said the execution would be, in her own words, a joyful occasion, the end of a wait that had lasted more than 2 decades. Before we go further into this story, please consider subscribing to Cold Case Whisperer. It's much appreciated, and it helps us keep bringing you real cold case stories like this one. Bridget Faye Townsend was born on June 26, 1982, in Houston, Texas, and by the time she was 18 years old, she was living in Bandera County, in the Texas Hill Country, where she was in a relationship with a young man named Joe Leal, who by his own later description was involved in dealing drugs out of his home. And it is important to say plainly that the public record of Bridget's life outside of the circumstances of her death is thin, the kind of thinness that is common in cases where a young life is cut short before it has the chance to be fully documented. So what follows is built strictly from what investigators, prosecutors, and courts were able to establish about the last night anyone saw her and the 23 years that followed. And nothing here is invented or dramatized beyond what is part of the public record, because Bridget Townsend deserves an accurate accounting, not an embellished one, and so does the difficult truth of how her killer was finally brought to justice, and how long that justice took to arrive. Bandera County sits in the Texas Hill Country, a region of ranch land, limestone hills, and small rural communities northwest of San Antonio. The kind of place where distances between neighbors can be measured in miles rather than blocks, and where, in the early 2000s, a missing 18-year-old could vanish from the public record with unsettling speed if the wrong combination of silence and geography worked against her. That is the setting into which Bridget Townsend disappeared on January 15, 2001. Bridget was at Joe Leal's home in Bandera County when 18-year-old Ramiro Gonzalez, who knew Leal as his drug dealer and had been struggling for years with an addiction that, by his own family's later account, began before he was even born, arrived at the house intending to steal drugs. Leal was not home, but Bridget was, and what happened next unfolded in a matter of hours that would not become clear to investigators or to the public for a very long time. Gonzalez abducted Bridget from the property, drove her to his family's ranch, and there he sexually assaulted her and shot her to death. He then disposed of her body in a rural field, and he went home and continued about his life as though nothing had happened. When Bridget failed to turn up in the days that followed, her disappearance was reported, and what began as a missing persons case slowly hardened, week by week and then month by month, into something far more ominous. There was no confirmed suspect, no confession, and critically, no body, which meant that for the family searching for her and for the investigators working the case, there was no way to close the door on the possibility, however faint it grew, that Bridget might still be found alive. That uncertainty is one of the cruelest features of cases like this one. It does not allow grief to settle into anything solid. It keeps families suspended between hope and dread for months that turn into years, and for Bridget Townsend's family, that suspended state would last for more than a year and a half. During those months, what limited public information exists about the case suggests a slow-moving investigation typical of rural jurisdictions handling a missing persons case without a crime scene, without physical evidence tying any one person to a location, and without, at that point, anyone in custody who investigators had reason to connect to Bridget at all. Ramiro Gonzalez was, as far as the public record shows, not on anyone's radar as a suspect during that stretch. He had known Bridget only through his connection to Joe Leal, and nothing in his background at that time flagged him to the people working her disappearance. Meanwhile, the man responsible for her disappearance was not sitting still. In September of 2001, roughly 8 months after Bridget vanished, Gonzalez abducted and raped a real estate agent in the Bandera area. The woman managed to survive the encounter and later testified that she believed she would have been killed had she not escaped. That crime led to Gonzalez's arrest, and in 2003 he was convicted of abduction and rape and sentenced to life imprisonment. That attack followed a pattern investigators would later find chilling in hindsight. A woman targeted while alone, taken by force, and by her own account fortunate to escape her life. At trial for that assault, she testified about believing she was going to be killed. Testimony that would later be reintroduced during the penalty phase of Gonzalez's capital murder trial for killing Bridget, not to prove what had happened to Bridget herself, but to help the jury weigh the question every Texas capital jury must answer: whether the person in front of them was likely to do something like this again. It was an unrelated case, on its surface, a separate victim, a separate assault, but it placed Gonzalez exactly where investigators needed him to be, in custody, and it was while he was being held in the Bandera County Jail, awaiting transport to state prison, that the case against him for Bridget Townsend's murder finally began to move. According to court filings later submitted on his behalf, Gonzalez did not confess to killing Bridget until he was interviewed by a television news reporter, and in that interview he admitted what he had done and led investigators to the location where he had left her remains. Her body was recovered in October of 2002 in a field in Bandera County, more than a year and a half after she disappeared. For nearly 2 years, Bridget's case had remained open but functionally frozen. Without a body, there was no forensic starting point, and without a confirmed suspect, there was no name to build a case around. It was Gonzalez himself, already behind bars for an unrelated and eerily similar crime, who finally supplied both, and for her family. The discovery closed one agonizing chapter of uncertainty, even as it opened a new and different kind of grief. The confirmation, finally, of what many of them had feared for a long time. If you have been following this channel for the confirmed cases where confessions and physical evidence finally line up to end an investigation, this is exactly the kind of resolution we try to document carefully and respectfully. And if this case is holding your attention, take a moment now to subscribe, because we cover verified true crime cases like this one twice a week, and it helps more than you might think. With Gonzalez's confession and the recovery of Bridget's remains, prosecutors in Texas moved forward with a capital murder case against him. The trial that followed hinged not only on establishing what had happened to Bridget, which by that point Gonzalez himself had admitted, but on the separate and specifically Texan legal question that capital juries in that state are required to answer: whether the defendant was likely to commit future acts of violence. A psychiatrist named Dr. Edward Gripon testified for the prosecution that Gonzalez showed a tendency to control, manipulate, and take advantage of others, and offered the opinion that he would pose a danger in the future. That testimony became a central pillar of the case, because under Texas law, a jury cannot sentence someone to death without finding that the person represents a continuing threat. Texas is one of the few states that structures capital sentencing this way, asking jurors not only to judge the crime that was committed, but to predict behavior that has not yet happened, a legal standard that has drawn criticism from some legal scholars over the years precisely because predicting future violence is notoriously difficult even for trained professionals, and because, as this very case would later demonstrate, the professionals themselves can change their minds. The jury found that Gonzalez met that standard, and in 2006 he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. At not yet 25 years old, He became one of the youngest people on death row in the United States at the time. The conviction closed the criminal case, but opened what would become one of the longest chapters in the story: the appeals process in the American legal system. A death sentence is rarely final at the moment it is handed down. It triggers a lengthy and mandatory review process designed to catch errors, and Gonzalez's case moved through that process for close to 2 decades, a span of time that is not unusual for capital cases in the United States, where the years between sentencing and execution, when an execution ultimately occurs at all, are often measured in decades rather than months. What followed was nearly 2 decades of appeals, delays, and legal maneuvering that is itself part of the documented record of this case. In 2019, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected one of his appeals outright. In November of 2021, his execution was delayed because of a broader legal dispute in Texas over whether a death row inmate's spiritual advisor could pray aloud or place a hand on the inmate during the execution itself, a religious liberty question that was working its way through the courts independent of Gonzalez's individual case. In July of 2022, he faced another scheduled execution date and received a stay at what his supporters described as nearly the last possible hour. Supporters who by that point reportedly included not only defense attorneys and religious volunteers, but correctional officers who had worked around him on death row, a detail his legal team leaned on heavily in later clemency filings as evidence of genuine, observable change rather than a defendant simply telling a parole board what it wanted to hear. And in a development that drew significant attention from journalists and advocates alike, in September of 2021, the same psychiatrist whose trial testimony had helped send Gonzalez to death row, Dr. Gripon, met with him on death row and concluded that his original prediction had been wrong, that Gonzalez was not, in fact, the continuing danger he had once testified he would become. This reversal became a central argument in the clemency petition filed on Gonzalez's behalf in the weeks before his final scheduled execution date. The petition, filed by his attorney, described a childhood marked by exposure to drugs before birth, by abuse, poverty, and abandonment. It noted that Gonzalez did not meet his own father until he was 19 years old in a county jail, that his mother, according to later reporting on the case, used drugs while pregnant with him and gave him up shortly after his birth, leaving him to be raised primarily by his grandmother, that he was, according to the same accounts, sexually abused as a child by a male relative, that he dropped out of school after the 7th grade, and that he was reportedly using drugs and alcohol regularly by the time he was 12 years old. Before his arrest, he had worked as a welder and as a fence builder, and had argued that in his more than 17 years on death row, Gonzalez had undergone a genuine transformation, devoting himself to religious study, self-reflection, and by some accounts to positive influence on other incarcerated men around him. He had also, according to reporting at the time, offered to donate a kidney to a stranger in need while awaiting execution. None of this was offered as an excuse for what he had done to Bridget Townsend, and it is worth being direct about that distinction here. The legal and moral weight of Gonzalez's crime against Bridget was never disputed, not by his own attorneys and not by Gonzalez himself. The clemency argument was narrower than that. It was an argument about whether the man scheduled to die in 2024 was still the same danger to society that a jury had been told he was in 2006 on June 24th, 2024. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles considered that argument and rejected it, voting 7-0 against clemency. 2 days later, on June 26th, 2024, Ramiro Gonzalez was taken to the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas, and executed by lethal injection. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 in the evening, local time. He was 41 years old in his final statement. he addressed Bridget's family directly, expressing that he could not find words adequate to the pain he had caused them, and saying that he had never stopped praying they would one day forgive him. Among those present at his final hours was a spiritual advisor who had known him for more than a decade and who later wrote publicly about the experience, describing him as a close friend and describing her own grief at watching the state carry out his execution. Her account, published after his death, adds one more documented layer to a case that by its end had accumulated an unusually large amount of public reflection from people on very different sides of it: prosecutors who spent years building the case against him, family members who waited more than 2 decades for its conclusion, and people who had come to know Gonzalez personally during his time on death row and who did not recognize the 18-year-old who committed the crime and the man he had become. Bridget's mother, Patricia, spoke to reporters afterward, and, while others around Gonzalez in his final years had described a changed man, she made clear that what she saw was the man who had taken her daughter's future from her. Bridget's brother told reporters that the family had finally witnessed justice being carried out, and that the day marked the end of a long and painful road for all of them. And there is one detail from that evening that neither side of the case disputes, and that no amount of legal argument on either side changes. June 26th was Bridget Townsend's birthday, and Ramiro Gonzalez died on that same date in 2024, on what her mother and multiple news outlets reported would have been Bridget's 41st birthday. Whether you view that as coincidence, as irony, or as something closer to a strange kind of symmetry, it is a documented fact, not a dramatization, and it is the kind of detail that tends to stay with people long after the details of a trial fade from memory. 23 years passed between the night Bridget Townsend disappeared from a home in Bandera County, Texas, and the evening her killer was finally executed for what he did to her. In that time, an entire legal system worked, slowly and imperfectly, through confession, conviction, appeal after appeal, a reversed expert opinion, and a final denial of clemency. Bridget's case sits at the center of a debate that extends well beyond Bandera County or even the state of Texas, whether the legal system should weigh who a person becomes in prison against what that person did before they arrived there. Reasonable people who followed this case landed on opposite sides of that question. Some pointed to Gonzalez's documented transformation, his religious conversion, his offer to donate a kidney to a stranger, the changed opinion of the very psychiatrist whose testimony had helped convict him, as evidence that his execution served little purpose beyond the crime itself. Others, including members of Bridget's own family, pointed out that whatever Ramiro Gonzalez became in his final years on death row, it did not return Bridget Townsend to her family, did not give her the decades of life that were taken from her at 18, and did not change the facts of what he did to her on a January night in 2001. This program does not take a position on which of those views is correct. That is a question each viewer has to sit with on their own. What this program can do is lay out, as accurately and completely as the public record allows, what happened to Bridget Townsend, what was done in her name over the following 23 years, and how her case, like so many of the cases we cover here, finally reached its documented conclusion. Cases like this one rarely offer anything close to a clean resolution. The family did not get their daughter back. No verdict or execution can undo what happened to her in January of 2001. What they did get, after more than 2 decades of uncertainty, appeals, and waiting, was an official and final answer to the question of who is responsible, and under the laws of the state of Texas, an account that was considered settled. Bridget Townsend was 18 years old when her life was taken from her. She should be remembered first as exactly that. A young woman with a future that was never allowed to happen, not simply as a name attached to a case file or an execution date. In the years her case remained unresolved, Bridget Townsend's name appeared mostly in court filings appellate briefs, and the occasional news article marking another stage, a killer's long path through the legal system. That is often what happens to victims in cases that stretch across decades. The process built to deliver justice on their behalf can end up, almost by necessity, centering the person on trial rather than the person who was lost. It is worth pausing on that imbalance here, because remembering Bridget accurately means remembering that before any of this became a legal case, she was an 18-year-old with a life in front of her in a small hill country community in Texas, and that everything documented in this program happened only because that life was taken from her. There's more that the public record allows us to say about who Bridget Townsend actually was, beyond the fact of her death. At the time she disappeared, she was working full-time at a resort in the Texas Hill Country and had applied to nursing school, waiting to hear back on that application when her life was cut short. Her mother, Patricia Townsend, later told USA Today that Bridget was a beautiful person who loved life and loved people, and that whenever she was reunited with someone she had not seen in a while, she made a point of hugging them. Small details, but the kind that, taken together, sketch the outline of a warm and forward-looking young woman rather than simply a name in a court file. Court records also fill in a more specific version of the crime itself than was known publicly for years. According to those records, Gonzalez entered Joe Leal's home intending to steal cocaine and found Bridget there alone. He took cash from the house, and when Bridget tried to call Leal to tell him what was happening, Gonzalez overpowered her, tied her up, and drove her to his grandfather's ranch. It was there that he raped her and shot her before leaving her body in a field. When Leal returned home later that night, he found Bridget's truck, her purse, and her keys sitting in their usual places. But Bridget herself was nowhere to be found. He called the police, and that call marked the start of a search that would not reach its answer for nearly 2 years. The family's experience during those 2 decades of appeals deserves its own accounting, because capital case that stretches for 18 years between sentencing and execution does not simply happen in a courtroom and then go quiet. It resurfaces again and again. Every appellate ruling, every stay, every clemency filing sends the case back into the news and back into the family's daily life. Bridget's brother, David Townsend, became the family's most visible public voice during that stretch. He filed petitions and posted repeatedly on Change.org opposing efforts to spare Gonzalez, pushing back directly against portrayals of Gonzalez as a reformed or redeemed man, and describing what Gonzalez had done to his sister in blunt terms as an unforgivable act. He argued publicly that the death sentence handed down by the jury in 2006 should be carried out as ordered, and in a written statement released around the time of the execution, he said the family was not seeking revenge, but rather closure and a measure of peace after years of heartache, a peace he said had been made harder to reach by decisions that kept Gonzalez and his case in the public eye for so long. That statement captures something important about what long-running capital cases do to the families connected to them. Closure is not simply granted at the end. It has to be pursued, year after year, through a legal process that operates on its own timeline, and often with little regard for how repeated exposure affects the people still grieving. Patricia Townsend's public statements in the days before the execution reflect that same tension. She told USA Today that the execution would be a joyful occasion for her family, an unusually direct word choice for describing a state execution, but one that makes more sense in the context of 23 years spent waiting for a legal process to conclude. When she learned that the execution date fell on June 26th, her daughter's birthday, she said she began crying and crying and crying, a reaction that speaks less to any belief in cosmic meaning and more to the sheer emotional weight of that particular date landing on that particular day. On the evening of the execution itself, The public record shows that Gonzalez was strapped to the gurney inside the Walls unit at approximately 6:05 p.m., with Patricia and David Townsend present in the viewing room along with other family members. Gonzalez spent roughly 2 minutes delivering his final statement, addressing Patricia and David by name and apologizing directly to them. After he finished speaking, the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered, and within a matter of minutes all movement had stopped. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. Afterward, David Townsend read a statement to reporters describing Bridget as a vibrant girl, full of love, who would never be forgotten, and saying that the execution, though it came only after 2 decades of delay, represented justice finally achieved and brought the family a measure of peace. The case also left a mark well beyond the Townsend family itself. In the small communities of Bandera and Bandera counties, a homegrown crime from 2001 became, over more than 2 decades, a recurring statewide and eventually national news story every time the case returned to court, whether for a routine appeal, a stay of execution, or a clemency hearing. It pulled Bandera County back into a spotlight that most small rural counties in the Texas Hill Country rarely experience. Residents who had lived through the original disappearance and search in 2001 found themselves, years later, still fielding a case that had never fully left the community's collective memory. That is a common but underexamined feature of long-running capital cases. The crime itself may be confined to a single night and a single rural property, but the legal aftermath draws an entire county, and sometimes an entire state, into a decades-long cycle of renewed attention. The case also became something larger in the broader conversation around capital punishment in Texas. One regional outlet described it directly as a lightning rod for debates about rehabilitation on death row, because it forced a genuinely difficult question into public view: whether a person who commits a horrific crime at 18 can, through decades of documented behavior, become someone meaningfully different from a person who committed it, and if so, what that should mean for how the legal system treats them. The reversal of Dr. Gripon's expert opinion added another layer to that debate, since it raised pointed questions about how much weight capital juries should place on expert predictions of future dangerousness, when even the expert who offered the original prediction can later conclude he was wrong. Advocacy groups opposed to the death penalty took up Gonzalez's case in his final years, organizing petition drives and public campaigns that, by some accounts, gathered more than 20,000 signatures asking Governor Greg Abbott to halt the execution. Those campaigns did not change the outcome. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency by a unanimous vote, and the execution proceeded as scheduled. But they are part of the documented record of how this case played out in public, alongside the equally documented and, in the end, more decisive record of the Townsend family's own public advocacy for the sentence to be carried out. The clemency campaign built around Gonzalez in his final months drew a notably broad coalition. Advocacy organizations opposed to his execution described plans for a virtual vigil timed to the evening of the execution, along with demonstrations near the prison in Huntsville. Their outreach included direct appeals to Governor Abbott's office, and organizers said they delivered petitions bearing more than 20,000 signatures to the state capitol in the days beforehand. That coalition, by its own description, included not only defense attorneys and religious volunteers, but musicians, prayer leaders from multiple faith traditions, and people who described having formed personal relationships with Gonzalez through years of correspondence or in-person visits. It is worth noting, for context, one legal fact that shaped how this case was even eligible to reach a death sentence in the first place. In 2005, the year before Gonzalez was formally sentenced, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that the Constitution prohibits executing anyone for a crime committed while they were under 18 years old. Gonzalez committed his crime against Bridget Townsend when he had, according to court records, just turned 18, a matter of months, placing him on the side of that constitutional line that still permitted a death sentence had the crime occurred even a few months earlier in his life. The legal path of this entire case would have looked different from the start. That detail does not change what happened to Bridget, and it did not factor into the jury's verdict. But it is part of the broader legal landscape this case sat inside, and it is one more reason the case drew attention from death penalty researchers and advocates well beyond Texas. Back in Bandera County itself, residents who lived through the original 2001 disappearance and the years-long search that followed watched the case re-enter local headlines repeatedly over the next 2 decades. Each new appellate ruling, each scheduled and then delayed execution date, brought reporters and camera crews back to a part of the hill country that otherwise rarely made statewide news. For a small rural county, that kind of recurring visibility is its own form of disruption, distinct from what the Townsend family experienced, but connected to it. Neighbors, former classmates, and longtime residents were repeatedly asked, across more than 20 years, to revisit a crime that had taken one of their own. Even those with no direct connection to Bridget or her family absorbed some version of that same fatigue. The sense that a wound the community had lived through once kept being reopened by a legal process operating on its own extended timeline. What remains, 23 years after Bridget Townsend disappeared from a home in Bandera County, is a case that is closed in the narrowest legal sense. A confession, a conviction, an execution, all on record, but one that continued to shape the lives of the people connected to it for decades after the crime itself. The Townsend family spent more than half of Bridget's mother's adult life waiting for a legal process to conclude, absorbing every delay as a fresh disruption to whatever peace they had managed to build in the meantime. The community around Bandera and Medina counties absorbed a version of that same disruption, smaller in scale but real nonetheless. Each time the case resurfaced in the news, the sheriff's office and prosecutors involved in the case moved on to other work over those same 2 decades. The courtroom where Gonzalez was first convicted eventually closed that chapter of its docket, and Texas as a state continued executing and sparing other death row inmates under the same future dangerousness standard that had shaped this case. But for the people closest to Bridget, none of that institutional turnover meant the case itself was finished. It simply meant the case kept being handled by whichever officials happened to hold those roles at each new stage of appeal. And Bridget Townsend herself, the 18-year-old who worked at a resort and had applied to nursing school and hugged the people she loved, remained at the center of all of it, not because the public record preserved much about who she was day to day, but because everything else that happened over the following 23 years happened only in response to what was taken from her. That is the part of this case that outlasts the legal proceedings, longer than the appeals, longer than the stays of execution, longer even than the sentence finally carried out in June of 2024. A family that never stopped speaking her name, and a small Texas county that never fully set the case down. If you want to go deeper into cases like Bridget's, cases built entirely on documented fact and followed all the way through to their real-world conclusions, you can find more of them on this channel, Cold Case Whisperer. If you found value in this story, please consider hitting subscribe and leaving a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next real cold case investigation. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.